Over the past 6 months, I wrote a feature film inspired by films like Ladybird, The Perks of Being a Wallflower, and The Social Network. It's called The Lyrebird, and it follows a high school boy who becomes popular by helping his classmates cheat on tests, intending to win over his crush. But his goals change when people and demons from his traumatic past at the school re-emerge. Like many writers, it's a story that's very close to my heart, as it's heavily inspired by my own sometimes confronting experiences with bullying, toxic masculinity, and the patriarchy. Which is exactly the reason I'm terrified of showing it to anyone. So if you're like me and fear AI taking your job less than actually showing people your work, let's self-mark our scripts against some of Christopher Nolan's top tips for good writing and see how we fare. Hopefully better than Tenet.
When you're dealing with a world of dreams, you need emotion. And so the central character played by Leonardo DiCaprio became the most important part of making the story relatable for the audience.
I think most people would agree that a relatable protagonist is paramount to telling a good story. When we share experiences with fictional characters, it thins the barrier between their world and ours, so this was extremely important to me. My protagonist, Owen McClelland, is one of the 20% of students at school who experience bullying. Further, he is a part of the 10% that claim it escalated to physical violence. Owen feels the aftershocks of these traumatic events long after they occur, which sadly is an all too common experience for victims of bullying. I relate to Owen's experience, and I know so many other people can too, so I'll give myself 10 points for this tip.
Never departing from the subjective storytelling, the human scale storytelling. And so I wanted to address the story very much in the language of suspense. That's the most visual language of film there is.
In my opinion, perspective is the most underrated tool at a writer's disposal. I feel like so many stories opt for the standard third-person omniscient view. Don't get me wrong, that perspective can be used to great effect, but through it, you have to intentionally create subjectivity by way of unreliable narrators, wacky chronology, and so on. With the subject matter at hand, I felt a strict first-person perspective was perfect. Our view of the world and characters is coloured the exact same way his is. The downside of this though is that certain things in the story must happen off-screen since Owen isn't there to see them, which in an audiovisual medium obviously isn't ideal. So with that being said, I'll give myself a 6 out of 10 for this tip because I feel like the pros outweigh the cons.
One of the things we were trying to do in the film, by putting people as firmly as possible into Leonard's head, we were really trying to make the audience question their own process of memory a little bit.
Good literature examines the human condition. We are supposed to see ourselves in what's depicted on screen, through music and in language. And as I'm sure many of us know, looking in the mirror isn't always pleasant. We're forced to confront things we don't like about ourselves and our behaviour. This reflectiveness is integral to my story. With societal constructs like the patriarchy featured in my story, I wanted to provide a nuanced analysis. I think I achieved this because writing this screenplay has genuinely made me question my role in perpetuating toxic masculinity and chauvinism. A flaw I can point to though is that while women's perspectives are certainly a part of my story, they take second place to that of men. And while I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing since it is a story primarily about men's issues, large-scale problems like the patriarchy involve everybody. So I'll give myself a 7 out of 10.
That was really the challenge in making Inception, was to keep everything grounded, to keep everything feeling like it was possible, even as what's happening in the film is, on some level, impossible.
I want you to think of your creativity like celestial gases floating in space. When you don't put any limitations on yourself, those gases are free to float around and nothing ever happens. It's only when you start restricting yourself, reducing the wiggle room, and forcing the gases closer and closer together that a star is able to form. In my story, a key rule was that everybody is capable of both kindness and evil. They're morally grey, as is said. With that, I want you to remember that while morally complex characters are certainly interesting, morally black or white characters can be as well, so long as you contrast them with something. Take Captain America. His first film is overshadowed by his second because the former pits him, a morally just character, against the morally unjust Red Skull. It's simple good versus evil. The latter, however, sees him take on the morally grey Shield, an institution with both good and evil agents. Steve never wavers his righteousness, and so what makes him interesting is how those principles guide him in a world of unsteady morals. If your story was a monochromatic photograph, it should of course have grey, but feature blinding whites and crushing blacks too. I think I accomplished this, so I'm giving myself a 10.
I've always been interested in that particular story element of the unreliable narrator. It had always been a problem to come up with the appropriate reason for the narrator being unreliable. Because to me, it's never been interesting enough, if the guy is just lying or if he's dreaming or, whatever.
Films that don't abide by this rule are the ones that get called pretentious. It's classic style over substance. This idea of everything in a story serving a purpose underpins a rule I feel some people are starting to forget, that everything in art is intentional. Yes, the curtains being blue in that meme does in fact represent the protagonist's feeling of sadness. The author could have made them red, yellow, maybe green, but they didn't. Why? Because it means something. Why is my story inspired by a lyrebird and not a kookaburra? It means something. Why is half of Oppenheimer in black and white? It means something. Why does Owen Driver 2006 hold an Astra in my screenplay? Okay, well, to be fair, I don't know that one. I just did it because I studied the Ladybird screenplay and Greta Gerwig named the exact make, model, and year of the car that Marion drives. That probably means something, but the Astra specifically means nothing. 7 out of 10.
I won't sit down to write something until I kind of know that I'm ready to and that the ideas are all in balance. And that can take a very long time.
As the guy from Big Nate once said, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. A solid plan for your screenplay is just another restriction, and as we discussed before, restrictions are how stars are born. Before you write anything, figure out your story's catalyst, or the call to action. Elwood's getting dumped, the spider biting Peter Parker. Figure out what happens at the midpoint, what happens at the end of Act 3, and finally, where it all ends. If you have these set in stone, it informs the rest of your story. Your thinking will shift from what do I write now to how do I make these beats smoothly transition between each other. A classic screenwriting board will help you. This is mine for the Lyrebird. I'm actually quite proud of my structure, so I'll give myself a 10.
I felt my own life and the things I saw in the world were not going to be of interest to people, but they felt interesting to me. And so I was looking for a language, I was looking for a genre in which I could take things that I was interested in and make them accessible, make them interesting to other people.
If I can tell you don't give a shit, I won't give a shit. It's as simple as that. I realized the importance of giving a shit after knocking myself for none of my characters having hobbies. I thought it was unrealistic, and so I wrote drafts where the characters had more explicit interests. It sounds like a no-brainer now, but once I figured out that I care most about who these characters are, and that their hobbies weren't contributing to that understanding, I cut them out. However, it always comes back to imbuing meaning. Oscar Isaac's character in Ex Machina works out a lot because it makes him physically more imposing and dominant, which aligns with his god complex. I'll give myself a 7 out of 10 for this, because there's a set piece at a party, and since I'm not a huge party guy myself, I care more about those little interactions, those little vignettes, and I think that shows in my writing.
Make something that has layers, something that has more to it the second time you see it, or some different aspect to it, into the narrative itself, into the story, if you like.
If you've ever watched a movie and not understood the ending, it's either really bad or really good. Films from the latter category are layered, which means some stuff is going to go over your head if you're not searching for it. But how do you achieve this? Subtext, the art of saying something without saying it. Symbols and metaphors. Anything can be imbued with meaning to become one of these. Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning occupies a physical and metaphorical role in my story with meanings that tie directly back to my themes. The lyrebird, the actual bird itself, is also a symbol, and although it only appears in one scene, that scene's placement in the chronology of the film, compared to or juxtaposed with the rest, carries meaning too. I think I've populated my story with lots of interesting symbols and metaphors, but I'll be honest, some of them can be a little on the nose, so I'll give myself an 8.
The way in which I approach different or complex structures is diagram it, you get a hold of it mathematically so you know exactly what it's meant to be doing.
Dull characters, a stupid plot, and little to no depth will all weigh down your story, but terrible pacing will kill it. This is why you must be attentive to structure. A general rule of thumb is that most spec scripts, aka scripts written with the hopes of being bought, should be about 90 to 110 pages long. You might think you need more than that, but trust me, you really don't. Case in point, one scene in my first draft was 10 pages long, but by the final, it was 3. I condensed all those pages down by trimming the fat and showing visually things I'd been telling previously. After applying that discipline all the way down the line, I ended up with a 107-page screenplay. Every page, every action line, and every piece of dialogue needs to push your story forward, because if it doesn't, it's boring. Once again, cram all those gases into as little space as you can and make a star. Say more with less. I would say the pacing in my screenplay is fairly good, save for the first, 10 pages. But hey, 10 slower pages is a pretty good trade-off for 100 great pages. 7 out of 10.
In your best case scenario of what can happen to you with putting a film out there and getting distribution, for example, you'll then ask the question, okay, well, what do you want to do next? And if you have an answer, you can use that very short window of interest.
As a creative, I'm always thinking about my next project, my next script, my next video. But if you're anything like me, every waking moment you're not working on the current thing, you're thinking about it, mulling over it in the shower, in bed, and I know, it's exhausting sometimes, but though it can be a curse, it's also a blessing. That constant thinking keeps your creative momentum going, it gives you direction, and it's easier to move if you know where you're going. As for the next project, I'm actually envisioning a trilogy of anthological screenplays based on the breadth of my school experiences, simply because I feel like I have interesting stories to tell, but who knows if I'll ever write them. I'll give myself an 8 out of 10 because it's the thought that counts, I guess. Alright, the results are in. According to Christopher Nolan's teachings, there is an 88% chance my screenplay is in some way good. Thank f***ing God. If you've written something, comment your score down below and we can cry tears of joy or despair together. If you'd like to read my screenplay, that is amazing. Thank you so much. I've left a link to the PDF in the description. Now before you go, there is a 10th and final tip from Christopher Nolan that he says might be the hardest one of all, so let's see how we fare. It is: write compelling female characters. Ja, goes it, and that's the flow in the cup, very in on myself.